You're already working flat out in your company's marketing department, and now you want to produce a podcast? Where would the time come from? In this video, I'll show you 5 hacks on how to save time when podcasting. And with that, hello, and welcome to a new video here on our channel. My name is Kurt Wojcicki. I am the owner of Kurt Creative, a 100% digital content marketing company, and one of our business areas is podcast production. We help companies and self-employed people to design, produce, and publish their own podcast. And right now, I keep hearing from some customers, Kurt, we have so many exciting topics in the pipeline that we really want to record a podcast episode on, but the problem is that we just don't have the time. We have so many channels that need to be covered, and we just can't find the time to produce the podcast episodes. So what should we do? In this video, I give you 5 practical hacks that you can start implementing in your marketing department tomorrow. Hack number 1, tools. With the right tools and programs, you can save a lot of time because you can let the computer do repetitive tasks that can easily be done by machine, saving you a lot of working time that you can spend on the really important creative tasks. An important category of tools are project management tools in particular, which you can use to collaborate in a team, but of course also to organize yourself and your own work. And there really are a lot of different programs on the market that specialize in project management, for example, Trello, Jira, Factro, Asana, and so on. So there are a whole host of different providers. I've personally had the best experiences with MeisterTask. They are very clear and very easy to use. Trello is practically the top dog among the simple project management tools. There are a whole host of additional functions that you can add. It really leaves nothing to be desired. A project management tool like this organizes your tasks in clear graphical representations, like a Kanban board, for example. You have several columns, and you can move individual cards back and forth in these columns. Depending on the current stage of the task, of course, you can also add several users and then simply add comments under a task and write, for example, colleague A, have you already asked the guest here? And then she writes back, now colleague B, yes, I have. The appointment is Monday, 12 noon or so. It's really, really simple. With project management tools like this, you can keep track of everything. Many project management tools like Trello also offer automation options. This means you can easily assign due dates to cards and have them automatically moved to other table columns, other boards, or even trigger things like emails on a specific due date. This means that an email is sent automatically, for example, to a cooperation partner. When a podcast episode has been accepted and completed, all the information is conveniently already included from this card, and you don't have to type in an email manually. So there really are a lot of clever things you can automate with project management tools like this. It's also very easy to automate the scheduling of appointments with guests. If you do this manually, a lot of emails are sent back and forth, because it's often not so easy to put the calendars on top of each other, and somehow an appointment comes in here and there's something else. It has to be moved. There are great tools for this, such as Calendly. With Calendly, you can easily enter availabilities in your calendar and send a link to the guest, from which they can then search for a free appointment in your calendar. You will then receive an email about the confirmed appointment, and the guest can, of course, also automatically add the appointment digitally to their calendar. There are also nice functions such as reminder emails. This means that 2 days before the recording date, for example, you can automatically send a reminder email to the guest so that they really remember to keep the recording date. And of course, it is generally advisable to use such email templates for scheduling because you usually write the same things, and so you save a lot of time. And if you want to publish content from your podcast episode as a blog post, for example, and create transcripts for it, then this is, of course, also a very lengthy process. I remember it from my bachelor thesis, for example. I had to transcribe interviews. Some of them were over half an hour long. And if I imagine that I had to do it all manually for a podcast episode, I wouldn't want to do it. Fortunately, there are tools that make transcribing podcast episodes easier. In other words, you simply upload the audio material and the artificial intelligence listens to the text. Of course, there are still a few mistakes that you need to correct, but you already have a good template to work with. Aphonic, for example, offers this function, as does AmberScript. These are both tools that are very suitable for transcribing a podcast episode. In short, tools that make your podcasting work much, much easier, make organization simpler, and relieve you of many automated processes that you would otherwise have to do manually, saving you a lot of time. If you are not quite sure whether this or that tool is suitable for you, you can simply request a free trial version of these tools. Almost all tools now offer trial periods, so you can try out all the functions and see whether this tool suits you and is really helpful in your everyday life. Tip number 2. Create a content strategy. A content strategy is, so to speak, a strategically organized approach to finding, creating, and ultimately publishing topics for your podcast. It's always very practical to use a bit of swarm intelligence and plan content on a fixed day each month. This really means collecting ideas for brainstorming first. You can also invite colleagues to join you on this day and also ask them to write down a few content ideas beforehand or throw them in a small notebox, and then the whole thing is evaluated once a month, and we look at which of these topics are exciting for us for the next month. In this monthly brainstorming session, it is really worth going through different categories step by step, i.e., tapping into different sources from which you can obtain new ideas. For example, this could be industry media, it could be competitors, but it could also be a survey of your listeners to find out what is currently the talk of the town, what is being talked about the most. Really go through these different categories one by one in each meeting, and then you will definitely come up with a lot of great ideas. A personal tip from me, I rarely have the best content ideas at my desk, but usually in very different places. For example, on the way to the co-working space, on the subway, in the shower, or in the park, on a walk, doing sport or whatever, I always make a list in my cell phone where I write down all these topics as quick notes. And when it's time to plan the next brainstorming meeting with my colleagues from marketing, I have this list ready and can say, hey, have we ever thought about doing this or that? Or would that be an exciting topic? Maybe we should also make a video about it. And a little tip if you want to take a networked approach right from the start. Then you can create a shared Google document in which everyone in your team can write their ideas. And yes, this way you can coordinate with each other a bit, maybe comment on the ideas, and then have a little idea ping pong before the big brainstorming session. Another hack, if you usually have topics that are not suitable for filling an entire podcast episode, then make sure that you always have a common thread in your episode. This is familiar from television news programs, for example. There's always a weather section and a sports section at the end. And even if the day has been a bit dull and not much has happened in the world, you've already filled a good third of the program. So create sections in your podcast, and this could be the topic of the week, the excitement of the week, the tip of the week, or whatever. Then you automatically have a small block of content that makes the podcast exciting, gives listeners structure, and above all, you don't have to fill an entire podcast episode with a single small topic. Sometimes, however, you won't create the content for your podcast episodes on your own or together with your colleagues from your team. This brings us to tip number 3. Finding guests can also be approached systematically and save a lot of time. A good guest brings a whole host of benefits for your podcast. For one thing, they naturally make the podcast livelier. They bring in new topics, new inspiration, and ideally, the guest also has their own network in which they can share the podcast episode and thus automatically make your podcast better known. But not everyone wants to be a guest on the podcast, or at some point you'll have already checked out the usual suspects and ask yourself, who else could I invite? Fortunately, there are proven strategies for finding exciting new podcast guests. First of all, you can look through your LinkedIn network and see if there are people who have recently appeared in a podcast, or if not in a podcast, then at least given an interview somewhere, e.g. in a blog, on a YouTube channel, or similar. These are usually people who are happy to share their knowledge and may also be of interest to you as a podcast guest. You can also check out other podcasts from your industry and see what guests have been there who might be interesting, who have told exciting stories, and you can of course write to them directly. So just go to their website, or if they work in a company, you can usually find a contact somehow, e.g. via LinkedIn, or perhaps officially via their personal email address. These are people who already have podcast experience, and they might be very grateful if they are invited to another podcast and can share their knowledge there. Of course, you can also ask other podcasters that you find exciting or influencers in general. Such people are, of course, always keen to expand their own network and are therefore very grateful when they receive requests to be a guest on another podcast. The last tip is often neglected. Just ask your community. You can ask regularly, for example, every month, hey, what guests would you really like to hear on our podcast? People are bound to think of a few people they've heard somewhere. Maybe there are suggestions that aren't so realistic because they're celebrities or something, but at least you have a good orientation and can evaluate the whole thing, so you'll definitely come up with some ideas. Well, now you're saying, all well and good. I can organize the preparations, plan, ask guests, no problem for me. But for the recording, I easily need at least an hour, if not 2 hours, because I have to prepare myself in peace. I have to make sure that the technology is set up, that everything works, and so on. You can easily shorten this by setting up a fixed setup that you use for every recording. Ideally, this should be in a certain corner of the room, not touched, but left as it is. All the settings on the devices remain the same, the cables all stay connected, so you avoid a whole host of pitfalls, e.g. loose contacts or any controls that are not turned up, and of course, the room acoustics. You can be sure that you always have the same sound that you can rely on, and you may also have the chair in the same place so that it is the same distance from the microphone. These are all things that save you a lot of time because you don't have to waste time testing and setting up the whole setup again and again. It's also always good for your own well-being to establish a certain routine when recording podcast episodes. This can be, for example, drinking a glass of water first, then doing a few vocal exercises, then going through the introductions again in your head, maybe going through a script, all that sort of thing. They give you confidence and ultimately make it easier for you to host the podcast in one go without any major slip-ups or interruptions. Once you're in the flow, you can, of course, record another episode, 2 podcasts in a row. You can usually manage that quite well. If there's more, then your concentration will suffer at some point. But having a fixed routine before recording a podcast definitely gives you a lot of confidence. You can always record at the same time of day. This has the advantage that you are at roughly the same energy level. Some people are more morning types, others are more afternoon types. Find out what works best for you, and then you can definitely make the most of this time slot. If you edit your podcast episodes yourself, then it makes sense to create a template session in which you already have all the elements you need for your podcast montage. This includes the intro, the outro, possibly a music bed, and of course, the settings for your microphone. There are already presets for the equalizer, compressor, limiter, and so on. This means you always have the same sound that you can rely on, and you don't have to make these settings again and again. I also have a preset like this for my podcast production when I edit the podcast episodes for our customers. Then I already have a template where I have different tracks for different types of voices, and I know exactly, now we have this presenter with this preset again. I can simply click in and then always rely on the same sound that I have already tried out extensively in many episodes beforehand. If you're not an audio production professional by nature, then the editing, mixing, and mastering of your podcast episodes, i.e. the entire production, is of course a pretty time-consuming aspect that can definitely eat up a lot of your working time. This brings us to tip number 5, which is to outsource such specialist skills to qualified freelancers or companies. For certain tasks where you are an expert yourself, I'm thinking primarily of the content. Of course, it's important that you stay at the helm and take on these tasks yourself because logically that's what you're best at. But for other things, for certain specialized things such as audio production, it definitely makes sense to hire people who do this all day long and are experts in this field. It naturally takes a lot of time to familiarize yourself with the complex processes of audio production. Producers have access to a whole host of tools that you may not have in your company. We, for example, work with a multi-stage editing process for all audio files in order to really squeeze the last bit of quality out of the material. We use the Avid Pro Tools program with a whole host of additional plugins that we have licensed. On the one hand, we can reduce background noise to a very, very high level, and of course, give each voice a special sound that gives it character so that your production is really at a high level and can also compete with podcasts from publishers or large media houses, for example. Therefore, my recommendation for the production area is to take a look at our podcast editing services. You can find the link in the info box below. There you will find an overview of the services we offer. I hope this video has given you a few practical hacks on how you can significantly speed up podcast production in your company and make it more efficient. And of course, I'm also interested to hear what other tips you have in store. How do you organize podcast production in your company? Feel free to let me know in the comments below. And of course, what experiences you have had, especially with the various automation tools. And if you don't want to miss another video from us, then subscribe to this channel and activate the bell so that you will always be informed when there is something new in the area of podcast production. Have fun podcasting and see you in the next video.